Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining us for this exciting Atlantic Council event today. I'm Barry Pavel, and I'm a Senior Vice President at the Atlantic Council and Director of our Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, where we focus on geopolitics, strategy, and security, which of course in our current era includes cyber statecraft front and center. We're thrilled to be co-hosting this event today with the Council's Geotech Center as well. The Scowcroft Center works to develop sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and its allies. The center honors the legacy of service of General Brent Scowcroft and embodies his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership in close cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. Our cyber statecraft initiative in the Scowcroft Center works to anticipate future cyber challenges and the needed strategy and policies, melding an operational perspective to important strategic questions ranging from the security of software supply chains to the integrity of global maritime energy networks. We're really excited to welcome back to the Atlantic Council today Mr. Chris Inglis, the inaugural National Cyber Director, to share his thoughts on the priorities and strategy of his new office as it takes a leading role in U.S. cyber policy and helps to advise the President. Mr. Inglis began his career at the National Security Agency as a computer scientist, and his tenure would eventually stretch more than 28 years, including 7.5 years as the agency's deputy director and senior civilian. Mr. Inglis has given 30 years of service as an officer to the U.S. Air Force, 9 years on active duty, and 21 years in the Air National Guard, from which he retired as a brigadier general in 2006. Most recently, while spending time at the U.S. Naval Academy as the Looker Distinguished Visiting Professor, Mr. Inglis served as a commissioner with the U.S. Cyberspace Solarium Commission. Following Mr. Inglis's remarks, we'll turn to a panel on one of the Solarium Commission's most forward-looking recommendations, the creation of a Bureau of Cyber Statistics. We'll be joined by our non-resident fellow and senior director with the Solarium Commission, Rob Morgus, to moderate a conversation between CSI fellows Ms. Bobby Stempley and Dr. Josephine Wolf, Chief of Staff to Representative James Langevin, Mr. Nick Lyerson, and Director of our Cyber Statecraft Initiative, Dr. Trey Herr. Please also follow us on Twitter and join the conversation at the hashtag ACCyber and from the @Atlantic Council, @AC Scowcroft, and @Cyber Statecraft accounts. With that, let me thank you, Chris, again. Good to see you again, for spending time with us this afternoon, and turn the floor over to you.
Hey, thanks, Barry. If I could get a thumbs up, you can hear me all right from this end? Excellent. It's a real pleasure to be here this afternoon. The Atlantic Council has a long history of bringing issues, diverse perspectives, and thoughtful moderation to yield solutions that are needed in the era of complex national security challenges. As Barry indicated, I'm going to try to do two things today. One, I'll give you an update on what we're doing to establish the Office of the National Cyber Director, not so much the logistics, but the lines of effort. And then I would like to make some comments on the topic of interest here, the Bureau of Cyber Statistics, and perhaps something or two downstream of that. An overview of the National Cyber Director. I think everybody on this session today probably is aware that it's been created. Along with perhaps innumerable Russians, all interested in what it's going to do. I would say that among its chief responsibilities established by statute is to give a premium to the totality of the national cyber strategy, as much or more to prevention, resilience, robustness as to response and recovery, and also a preference for integration and collaboration across diverse stakeholders. That must be a preferred modality. What the statute does not specify, however, are the key outcomes and objectives that the office should accomplish. I think everyone in their own mind's eye has a sense as to what that might be, but we've taken some time in the first few weeks to try to lay that out with greater precision, and again, taking some care to align that with what Ann Neuberger does as the Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber, and what Jen Easterly is doing as the quarterback on the field over at the Department of Homeland Security. In point of fact, began my day this morning talking to Ann about some initiatives, and I've just come from an hour-and-a-half session face-to-face with Jen Easterly. So what I describe is not meant to be independent or a stovepipe amidst all of that, but rather something that complements the players that are already in this space. There are 4 lines of effort that I would draw your attention to where the National Cyber Director intends to make a difference, and not, again, independent of the players already on the field. The first line of effort is federal coherence. In federal cybersecurity, there are technology issues, there are roles and responsibilities issues, and then at the end of the day, there are people issues that we're perhaps a little bit short on in terms of having the kind of coherence that an enterprise of that scope and scale requires. So the National Cyber Director is intending to try to figure out how do we actually follow through in the executive order in May to make sure that the digital infrastructure, the stuff that constitutes the digital infrastructure, has the right technology, the right practices, such that we can achieve unity of effort, unity of purpose across at least 102 civilian components of the federal enterprise, and consistent with what happens in the intelligence community and the DoD communities. Riding on top of that digital infrastructure are CISOs, again, 102 in number across the federal enterprise. And we need to ensure that they have common standards, common practices, and that they essentially operate with unity of effort, unity of purpose, such that we can assist those who might need assistance at some particular point in time and understand at any moment in time what the state of play is across all of those. We have for too long been defending these various patches as if they're independent of one another. They might have independent oversight, they might have independent budget lines, but they can no longer have an independent cybersecurity strategy that stops at some boundary. The second broad line of effort, if we can get the federal enterprise into a place where it's coherent, is private-public collaboration. And I mean that in every way, shape, or form. I think private-public division of effort is an agreement to not collaborate. And what we need is something where we essentially have a merge of the capabilities, authorities, and the will of those various components, so that if you're an adversary in this space, you need to beat all of us to beat one of us. You can't pick us off one at a time. What we're looking for in that regard is a true joint partnership respecting privacy, proprietary information, civil liberties, but at the same time combining our insights and knowledge about what threats are holding us at risk, so that, again, if you're an adversary, all of a sudden you find that we're crowdsourcing you the way you've crowdsourced us. The third line of effort is present and future resilience. And while much of the government is focused on the resilience of the here and now, we need to make sure that it's going to last and endure, not simply across administration boundaries, but across technology boundaries, and to a time and place where perhaps we face less threats, but nonetheless, there can be a surprise coming out of the upper left-hand corner. And that future resilience needs to also be based upon more than technology. We need to make sure that our people are prepared. All of us understand something more about the nature of the digital ecosystem than we might have picked up simply by making use of the apps that ride on top of it. That some of us who are in professions which have a particular impact on cyber understand a little bit more, perhaps in the practice of law, the practice of system engineering, the practice of anything, what the implications are in terms of our design inside of a world dependent upon digital infrastructure. And that finally, the few of us who have cyber or IT in our names show up in sufficient number with the right skills such that we can make the difference that's required. I think, as you all know, broadly across both the government and the private sector, in that last category, if you have the word cyber or IT in your name, you're probably running about 2/3 short at the moment. About 1/3 of those positions are at present empty. We're not going to solve that by creating a flock of Bachelor of Science in Computer Science, or for that matter, Master in Computer Science. We're going to have to re-examine the skills that are actually required and appeal to the broader ecosystem to provide the talent that's required. The last thing in present and future resilience, which is often overlooked, is we need to get the roles and responsibilities right. I mentioned earlier in private-public collaboration that we need to strive for collaboration, not a division of effort, or worse, a deconfliction. We need to try to figure out how do we get those roles to complement one another. To be sure, there will be some overlaps. Those overlaps might at some point look like they're either contentious or perhaps ambiguous, but those overlaps are going to be a feature in this system if we have unity of effort, unity of purpose, and we're going to have to work our way through to understand how we achieve that. The last line of effort of the 4 that I mentioned is to reconcile resources with aspirations. That's another way of saying that the National Cyber Director has an oversight responsibility on budgets. It's a soft power, it's not a hard power. I can't move dollars, but I do have the authority and the responsibility to look at the cyber budgets across broadly the federal civilian ecosystem, and to report on those, not simply to the Congress, but to the stakeholders who are responsible for managing those budgets. My sense is that if we use that authority properly, we can make sure that we've got a good story to tell the Hill at the time we tell the Hill that story. Nonetheless, that power can be used for good or ill, and I intend to use that thoughtfully ahead of time to make sure that we're driving the system as much as we're reporting on that system. I'd now like to turn my remarks to the Bureau of Cyber Statistics, which is, I think, what the primary discussion is about today. But I'd like to start with just a very brief perhaps appeal to first principles. The backdrop for this proposal is clearly one where intuition alone, we have discovered, is insufficient to manage a complex system. And yet we try so often to do it on that basis alone, that we think that our response instincts are appropriate to any given situation. We simply rush the problem, or where we, looking through our soda straw, think that we know enough on our patch to kind of manage this problem. I would observe that that's simply not true, especially when we're up against an adversary who they crowdsource us in ways that we've not begun to think about crowdsourcing them. One of my kind of favorite anecdotes, not being a student of history, but reading it on occasion, is from Benjamin Franklin when he was the Postmaster General, which, having now kind of access to all the postmasters across the burgeoning nation, he happened to ask them for a task above and beyond what they would normally do. He said, write down on a postcard every couple of hours what weather you're observing and send that in. And he laid all that out then and discovered, I think for the first time, that weather doesn't emanate from local conditions, that weather actually has these sweeping campaign-like phenomenon that comes generally in the United States from west to east, that high pressures generally precede good weather, cold pressure generally precedes bad weather. But it wasn't until we put that picture together that we understood what was happening locally. The same thing's true in terms of what's happening in cyberspace. Unless we can kind of ride across the boundaries that jurisdictionally divide us, we're not going to find out the trends that essentially afflict all of us. And we therefore have to appeal to a collection of that data by something, somehow, so that we can get our arms around this. To that end, the Solarium Commission has proposed the establishment of a Bureau of Cyber Statistics at the Department of Homeland Security to collect, analyze, and publish. The most important attribute in that is to publish the data and statistics related to cybersecurity, cybercrime, and cyber threats. It will mandate that organizations providing cybersecurity incident response services or insurance products furnish such information as determined by the director of this activity for statistical purposes every 180 days. I would observe that to properly address risk, we have to first understand it. We have to understand where it's concentrated, where it cascades, what causes it, and more importantly, to then discover how to address it. The Bureau of Cyber Statistics would do just that. I'm at pains to say that while the White House does not yet have an official policy on this, we're still working our way through consideration. I think all would agree that in the absence of this information, we are going to be episodic, we are going to be uneven, and perhaps less than optimal in our response to any of these threats which affect all of us in common. I would say that this is not without precedent. The government has, in a number of other challenges, whether that's in crime or tracking employment or tracking the economy, used a similar strategy to say that we first have to aggregate the information, tease out the trends from it, synthesize that, and produce it for the benefit, the use of all. I would say that this can be no exception, particularly whereas in this case, unlike some of the others, we have active adversaries stalking us, and they can, at more than Darwinian speed, adjust that threat in full measure to perhaps outwit us in our ability to defend ourselves. I would say that if we generate that information using something like a Bureau of Cyber Statistics, that's only part of the equation. The question then will become what to do with that. There are a number of other Solarium and other proposals that are out there helping us understand how we can use this information to better effect. One of those is the National Cyber Resilience Assistance Fund, a pot of money that could be used ahead of events based upon information as rich and as full-featured as what we're describing for ourselves today. And using that money, we could in fact invest in a system where we achieve resilience and robustness to avoid sort of the problems that we've been experiencing over the last many years, so that we actually kind of move the events right well to the right of us. We stand well to the left of that. And the stories that we can't tell are not based upon proprietary information, privacy information, or classified information. They're the things that did not happen. I just kind of would close by saying the following, which is we've done some things that approach kind of the feature of a campaign. whether that's the National Security Memorandum that was recently released that talks about improving cybersecurity for critical infrastructure control systems, whether that's the executive order out of the government in May, whether that's various proposals that are out in the private sector as to how do we get ahead of this problem. But all of those depend upon more than intuition. All of those depend upon a robust, well-collected body of information that allows us to then stand on the firm foundation of knowing what we're talking about as it cascades across the boundaries that would otherwise divide us. I've spoken very quick and skated fast across some thin ice. I think we have a minute or two for a question or two. I look forward to discussions, but more importantly, to taking influence from them.
That's fantastic, Chris. Thank you for spending some time with us on this. If we do have time for a question, let me take moderator's prerogative and ask you this. In outlining that vision, you mentioned resilience at the top, in the middle, and throughout. And this notion of trying to drive systems to fail gracefully, to understand ourselves better, to be more flexible in response to threats. I'm curious where you see the lowest hanging fruit for the office in the first year for what is a sizable concept and in some ways an overwhelmingly challenging engineering project.
Yeah, well, actually, you said that in a more articulate fashion than I did, so I would say ditto to what you just said, Trey. But I would say that the 4 lines of effort that I've laid out, in our view, are through a Pareto analysis, the places where we think we can make the most strategic difference. There are a lot of tactical issues that we could pick up and run with, but if we can create unity of effort, unity of purpose amongst the CISOs, if we can create unity of effort, unity of purpose between the various cyber centers who engage the private sector, such that when the private sector looks back at the federal government, it sees an emerging good, if not best practice, and it sees that you don't need a PhD in government to know who to deal with in government. I think that we're in a far better place of then achieving collaboration, which is in that second box, which is going to be transformative. Imagine we get from a place where each have to defend ourselves based upon what we alone inside of our stovepipe knows to a place where I actually know something about what's coming at me. I know something on the left, something on the right about the nature of the ecosystem I'm in. You can then, based upon information that might come from Bureau of Cyber Statistics, build your defenses such that you understand truly what your adversary's game is, and essentially steal the march by not so much responding well, but by preventing well. There's an old adage in the world I came from in Air Force aviation that good pilot can get out of any scrape, but a great pilot doesn't get into them in the first place. I think that's the transformative moment where we essentially invest in resilience and robustness and in collaboration such that we're a much harder target, a much more resilient, much more robust target. We can do that in the near term, even without demonstrable substantive changes in the underlying technology.
Helpful, and it's a vision I think we're going to talk a lot about here in the next hour. Chris, thank you so much for spending some time from us today. And I think in painting that picture of needing to tighten the sinews between these different institutions, data comes to mind as a significant part of that conversation and the meat of those sinews. So if we can, I'd like to turn it to Mr. Rob Morgus and this panel that's going to discuss the Bureau of Cyber Statistics, the potential venue in which much of this data, many of these metrics, and a lot of these conversations will be centered. As we're going forward into this discussion, I want to frame just with 2 quick points. First is that this is an area of active engagement by the legislature. The Hill is going to be taking up this proposal here in just the next month and a half. And as we talk about this problem, I think you're going to hear varying perspectives from academia, from industry, from here within our own shop at the Atlantic Council, as well as on the Hill. And we're hoping to paint a fulsome picture, both of possibility, but also feasibility. And so with that rather small mandate, let me turn it to Rob to introduce our panel and get us going.
Yeah, thank you, Trey. And what a treat, as always, I think, to hear from Chris and to hear how things are going in spinning up the National Cyber Director in that office. A lot of work, and we couldn't have a better guy in post, I think. So just by way of a brief overview of what we're going to do here, as Trey already alluded to, we're going to have a conversation about the Bureau of Cyber Statistics. We have about an hour and change. Hopefully we'll get, half hour, 40 minutes of good conversation amongst the panelists who I'll introduce here in a second. And then I want to leave around 20 minutes for folks from the audience. And I already see that we have some questions rolling in, and hopefully more will roll in throughout the panel as well, just to sort of have some interaction with you all and answer some questions, hopefully some thoughtful ones, as we sort of move over to the next hour. So without further ado, I'll say a couple things before we get started. The Bureau of Cyber Statistics, as both Barry and Chris and now Trey have alluded to, is a product of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. but for us to take full credit for it would be completely disingenuous. There were lots of people, thought partners involved in sort of developing the idea. We tossed around a bunch of different ideas, including things like a national transportation safety board for cyber and how that would fit in with the Bureau of Cyber Statistics and the like. And we're blessed or fortunate today to have several of those integral thought partners with us on this panel, starting with Bobby Stempley, who arguably I think was the most influential with the work that the Solarium's done here in sort of the creation of the concept of the Bureau of Cyber Statistics. Bobby is right now a VP and Business Unit Security Officer for Dell. Next to her, at least where I sit, is Nick Leischerson, who Barry introed already. He's the Chief of Staff for Congressman Jim Langevin in the House. Then we have Josephine Wolf, who is an Associate Professor at the Fletcher School at Tufts, a leading and esteemed cybersecurity expert from where I sit. And then finally, last and arguably least, we have Trey Herr from the Atlantic Council's Cyber Statecraft Initiative. To get things started, I do want to turn to Bobby first. And just as one of the sort of founders of this idea, or the early frontrunners for this idea, just turn to you to give us a concept, an overview of what BCS is, the Bureau of Cyber Statistics is, what it would do, who the partners would be in government, out of government, and the like. So Bobby, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it, Rob and Trey. And I tell you, you couldn't have a better advocate for this concept or articulation of it than what Chris just did. So really, the concept has matured in such a way that I think is truly profound and really represents the possibility for real change as we can continue to drive it forward. So this construct of a Bureau of Cyber Statistics is fundamentally different than the constructs we've been pushing, the constructs of threat sharing. And it's not to say that threat sharing isn't an important activity, and public-private partnerships around collaborative defense are not important and valuable. In no way is it to be dismissive of that, but it's to really fill a meaningful gap. And that is that we have, as Chris pointed out, a lot of intuition about what the right things to do are, about what the greatest risks are, and very little structural foundational knowledge to support either reinforcing that intuition or undermining that intuition. And which for me, I find shocking in a world that is so data-driven, right? The digital future is about the data, and we have such a focus on this data in so many ways that in this space where we're talking about systemic and enterprise and local risks of being digitized, of threat action, to have this dearth of information to make meaningful long-term decisions, I just found to be particularly shocking. And so, right, the mission statement's clear. It's laid out by in the Solarium Commission, right? Collect, process, analyze, disseminate, publish essential statistics and analytic methods that support the evolution of the cyber or digital ecosystem. Right? And so that broad statement is I think, Trey, you said a mammoth task there. And so really decomposing that into some near-term real value propositions about the efficacy and efficiency of the things that we're doing become important. And so alignment of effort and responsibility inside the federal government is an interesting and admirable goal. I have a career inside the government, in academia, and now in industry. And that's an incredibly important thing. But if we can align more than just our federal enterprise around accurate and effective risk models for cyber, that could be profound. Right now, we're lining up an industry backdrop, we're lining up a government backdrop, we're lining up an international backdrop around something that is data-driven. And so these common risk models become an important element here, and not an element that's only of use by government, right? This is an element that can be used by industry partners as well. Thinking about how we measure efficacy of the solutions that we have in place, whether they be programs or technology solutions, becomes an important element of this. And you do that a bit at a time, right? So collection of a little bit of data, understanding of that data, analysis of it, making good results from there. And then thinking about how you meaningfully collect and analyze this information, right? We start with a lack of taxonomy and a lack of community agreed upon analytic methods. And so a single place which could bring together the community in order to develop such a thing can be incredibly powerful, right? It can start, a colleague of mine was sharing with me some data collection in the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services about public health interventions. And it started with, what are the key questions, right? What's that first question that you need to ask? How do you ask it in a repeatable way? How do you ask it such that the results are then collected in a meaningful way? How then do you create that foundation for doing the analytic wherewithal on the back end? And so we have data consumers and data producers. And in many instances for this bureau, they'll be the same party could be both, right? You heard Chris talk about the insurance industry, and I'm really excited to hear some of Josephine's constructs later. I know her thoughts here are really rich. And so, there are data repositories in many of those instances that can be brought in and normalized and analyzed there. Think about the ability to expand our understanding of the environment beyond just the sectors that are aligned in a particular ISAC, or just the sectors that are customers of a particular threat sharing resource. Think about the power of that global picture to support everything from government policy making to local enterprise business decision making there as well. We have state and local governments who are making decisions every day. So this, it is a little government-esque when we're talking about policy, resource allocation kinds of decisions that might be made there as well. And finally, as an enterprise risk official, right, the opportunity to really understand and baseline what I have in a meaningful way when a particular organization might sit in the digital ecosystem, how you baseline there as well, I think can be really another powerful mechanism. So I see this as a staged activity. Right? We have to start with what are the analytic questions, and how do we start with the data collection and data analysis process? That publish component is so important because academic advancement in this area only happens if there's data to advance against. And so the ability to have that published, not just for government policymakers at the federal or state level, but for industry decision makers and for academic activity becomes a really important consumer base to really think about and to be focused on.
Brilliant. That is
longer, but really think we need to.
That's a great table setter, I think. And I already see questions coming in, so thank you for that. Keep those coming, and we will get to those in a bit. A few big things that I sort of take away from that, Bobby. I think, the BCS would play an important role as an aggregator. That's incredibly important, right? And we'll talk in a little bit about the state of play with regard to cybersecurity metrics, where all that sits in a bit here. But that's a major role, standardizing how that's collected, where it comes from, and the like. The sort of longitudinal aspect of it, I think, also can't be underplayed. And I think the point that you made about, there needs to be somebody who's beginning to ask the questions that we know we need to be answered. I think that's another interesting role. And then finally, monitoring and evaluation of what's working and what doesn't, in government and outside of government. I think those are some incredibly important roles that I think we'll see the BCS play as we move forward.
And the one thing, Rob, I think is really important is, and we captured it you captured it in the Solarium Commission report, this is a statistical agency, right? That's a term of art in the federal government. And it's an important term of art, an important element for this particular activity, right? It has to meet a level of professional rigor, and it serves a public role here at that trend level as well.
Yep, absolutely. And I think couldn't have said it better myself. So let's pivot here, Nick. I'm going to go to you next to talk a little bit about sort of what's the state of play right now. Where are we at when we talk about implementing many of the things that Bobby talked about. I know, we've talked about it in the past. It's likely that we'll require an act of Congress to get this sort of fully baked. What are the different proposals out there? What are some of the considerations that you and your peers have been looking at? How do we get data? Where could it fit into the federal government and the like?
Thanks, Rob. And thanks, Trey and Barry, for having me on a panel that knows much more about this issue than I do. So it's very intimidating to follow Bobby, who wrote the idea in the first place, but I will do my darndest. And I will also just add that, as ever, I will try and represent Congressman Langevin well, but I'm sure I will fail in some ways. So please don't take anything that I'm saying as directly his position on anything. So I'm going to do one bit of framing for how I think the Hill tends to look at the BCS problem statement, and then 3 areas that we're looking at in terms of what does practical implementation look like. So there's a micro problem set and a macro problem set that has resonated in my bosses and my conversations on the Hill. And they really stem from when Congressman Langevin first got interested in this issue, which was around the release of the CSF, the NIST cybersecurity framework. And the NIST framework came out, and he had a policy question. He said, Nick, we've been doing this for a year since the executive order. The CSF is out. How's it doing, right? Just from a strictly public policy evaluation standpoint, is this getting at what we want to? Are we better off today as a country because we have the CSF? And we thought about that some, and we said, well, probably one of the ways you would want to figure that out is, are the entities using it, the critical infrastructure entities, the businesses, the government agencies using the CSF, are they better off? So we put those 2 things together and started thinking, well, how are we going to answer this question? How do we say this is a good marginal use of our government's attention or tax dollar? And as an agency or as an entity, a private sector entity, it makes sense to use your marginal cybersecurity dollar to work on using the CSF to manage your risk. And we did not have any good answers to those questions. And we tried to look for data sets that might be able to help. And the best we found, we went to NIST, and NIST was like, well, we put out an RFI and we asked people, how are you using the cybersecurity framework? And wouldn't you know it, of the 80-ish people who responded, 79 of them had heard of the NIST cybersecurity framework and were using it. So we have pretty good penetration. And I'm like, well, I don't know how many people answer NIST RFIs that don't already know about NIST, at least, which I don't know if that's a lot of companies in this country. So that really kind of captures the 2 things that I think help policymakers get a handle on what is an output from the BCS that's going to be helpful. Like down the line, we're now going way back to the beginning of the process in terms of saying, well, we need to collect some data first before we can analyze them and then be able to answer some of these questions. But those are the 2 types of questions we're interested in, is policy-wide, macro, is this the kind of thing, the direction that we want to be going in? Is, for instance, the Cyberspace Solarium Commission recommendations, are these really producing the effects that we're interested in, and we're actually moving in the right direction towards more security? And then at a micro level, for any particular enterprise, are the controls that, as Bobby said, we're relying on intuition for right now. It's kind of like, this seems right. There's logic behind it, right? It is rational. Is it empirically actually backed up in terms of, yes, using these controls is worthy, is going to reduce your risk in a meaningful way, and not only worthy and meaningful, but probably is prioritized in some way, because we're trying to do risk management. And while I could reduce my risk here, if there's somewhere that I could reduce it more for less, then we've got the market on our side. If we can demonstrate that, then people are going to be marginally investing their dollars in ways that are hopefully more meaningful to improving the security of the ecosystem. So that's kind of like how we tend to think of the problem set and what a BCS can start to get us to. But then there are three kind of practical considerations that are driving the policy-making conversation right now. And I'll go from relatively easy to solve to relatively harder to solve. So the easiest to solve is the scoping question, which is how much belongs to BCS versus how much belongs to everyone else, right? And I think that everyone that I've talked to completely agrees with Bobby that publishing and broad access to the data and making sure people like Professor Wolf can do the wonderful things that she does is fundamental. That's table stakes. No one is discussing anything other than that. But there is a question of how much analytical work is likely to come within the BCS. You know, there's some unstated assumption that there's a minimal level to do things like taxonomy, right? So that we have an ability within BCS to know are we asking the right questions in whatever data we're aggregating. But going beyond that, is there some analytical role for BCS, or is it mostly we're going to aggregate the data and then it'll be largely extramural, whether it's another government agency, the private sector, academia, think tank who will make use of it? So that's question one. Question two, that's relatively easy because I think there are good arguments on all sides, and it's also something that's easier to come back and change if we decide we've changed our minds. Question two is the resourcing. It's tied to question one, obviously, but there is a question of who is going to put forth the bodies to staff the BCS. Where will they live? Will they live at the Department of Commerce? Will they live at the Department of Homeland Security? Will they live elsewhere? How are we going to fund it? What kind of, you can see how questions 1 and 2 are related, in that the more we think the appropriate resourcing is, the more potentially the scope can be. But even within whatever scope we've set, how big are the problem sets that we can take on? And that's largely going to be a resourcing question. That's harder because anytime you're trying to spend money, the taxpayers' dollars, you need to be careful about making sure you truly understand what you want to spend it on. And then the third, and really I think the fundamental question from a policymaker standpoint, is the authorities to collect data. And this comes to the fact that there have been voluntary data aggregation proposals in the past tied to incident data. They haven't necessarily worked as well as we could have hoped. The cybersecurity insurance data working group, I may have left out a letter in the CDOG acronym there, is an example where I think it was really great fundamental policy setting that was meant to be voluntary and then kind of petered out, perhaps because of the voluntary nature. But that authorities question of, to the extent that you're collecting data from inside the government, okay, that's pretty easy. I think we can mandate that. But for any external data sources, how you get those data aggregated, and whether you are going to say, I think it's on folks to say, if they say, well, it should be voluntary, say, okay, then you need to prove to me what's different from the last time. But the world has changed. We have a national cyber director that didn't exist 6 years ago when CDOG was a thing, right? So there could be good reasons that something has changed, or else if it's going to look elsewise, whether we're going to acquire data, and that's really what the limits of authorities are going to be, you can go out and purchase it. That, of course, affects the resourcing question now. Or if there are any authorities to mandate collection, the way that some of the statistical agencies have, you can look at what would the scoping for that be, and how broad would it be? So for instance, one thing that I have heard, and I may have heard it from myself, is the idea that perhaps insurance claims, like some sort of mandatory aggregation of insurance claims data, might be a good database that you could start with from the private sector in a way that is you're already talking about third-party information of sharing, or the second party. You're sharing with someone you have a contractual obligation with. So those are the three categories, I think, of things that policymakers are looking at. What is the scope of the work BCS does day to day? What is the resourcing that needs to be placed with it, and where those resources are going to come from in terms of a cabinet agency? And then what data collection authorities, if any, will it be vested with in the beginning? And particularly the last one, I think, is very important to get right out the gate, or you may wind up in a place that you kind of stumble out of the starting gate because without access to good data, you're not necessarily going to be able to provide all that much value that policymakers are looking for. So I have prattled on too much, but I will toss things back over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Nick. And I think that's a really good overview. And I think you unpacked a few of the big questions. And I think to your point, sort of scoping, feel pretty good that we've got a general consensus on what we think it should be doing. The resourcing is still, I think, an open question. I think you're right. DHS, Commerce seem like the obvious choices, and it's a matter of sort of where the glove fits best. And the authorities to collect data is going to be really interesting. And just sort of to put my position out there on the table and the way that the commission's been thinking about this is there are certain entities in the private sector. So obviously, to Nick's point, it's easy to grab data from the federal government. That's an easy thing to figure out. There are certain entities in the private sector that, as a matter of course of their business, collect data. Thinking about, for example, insurers, thinking about cybersecurity incident response companies and the like, and potentially looking at a framework to incentivize them to report on a sort of somewhat regular basis to this entity, I think is an interesting way to go. And for those of you who want to sort of see a more fleshed out version of legislation or potential legislation on this particular topic, Senators King, Sass, and Rounds just proposed the Defense of U.S. Infrastructure Act. Last week, the full text should be hitting congress.gov here at some point shortly. And in there, among the provisions is a Bureau of Cyber Statistics provision. So that's a good place to start if you're sort of thinking about the same things that Nick is. Let's move to Josephine here, Dr. Wolf. You have, like Bobby and like Nick, been thinking about this for a long time in a couple of different contexts. You also, as from where I sit, have among the most knowledge of sort of the state of play of cybersecurity metrics outside of the federal government in particular. Would love to hear from you how you assess that state of play. What are some specific use cases for something like the Bureau early on, and what could we expect on that front?
Thank you. I'm very honored to be here. I'm really glad you organized this. And as is perhaps too often the case in these kinds of conversations, I want to come in and say the thing I've spent my entire adult life studying, which is cybersecurity, is actually something we know extremely little about. So Rob asked me to talk a little bit about kind of specific use cases for our Bureau of Cyber Statistics. And you've already heard some referred to. I'm going to bring those up. I'm going to reference a few others and try to give you some examples of questions that I wish I could answer, questions I feel I should be able to answer as somebody who's been in this space for a long time and really don't have good answers to. So for instance, Nick brought up the NIST cybersecurity framework, right? That's a real question that organizations ask all the time. How much advantage is there to actually walking through this framework and implementing it? Does it actually prevent breaches? Does it actually, lead to smaller claims and settlements in the aftermath of incidents? That's a set of questions we don't have good answers to. But I would say even sort of before we get to the question of what actually works as countermeasures, there's another even more kind of baseline set of questions that I can't answer. And those are questions like, is the risk of ransomware getting worse? Right? That's a question that has an answer. There should be some way to say, there were more ransomware attacks this year than last year, or that people paid more money for them, or they cost more. But we really, really don't have any good data on that. And I think you're starting to see with some of the very high profile ransomware attacks in the past year, some very small steps towards requiring a little bit more reporting, but you're seeing that in very piecemeal ways. You're seeing that in sort of very specific sector slices that are going to have to report, and you're not seeing it necessarily in a kind of public reporting fashion, not in a way that's going to enable anybody outside of those offices of government to be able to say anything very definitive about that. So you have these two broad sets of questions. One, sort of, what does the risk landscape look like? How is it changing? What kinds of threats should we be focusing on, either as an organization or as a country? Where should we be investing? And then another set of questions, which is, of the enormous world of different approaches and countermeasures and controls that are for sale or freely available from NIST or wherever else, which of those actually work? Which of those actually seem to correlate with better outcomes or fewer incidents? And it drives me crazy that I can't answer those, right? I spent a lot of time during the pandemic working with hospital networks that were really worried about ransomware and really worried about cyber attacks. And to have as little good data as we have is very frustrating and really hurting people, really hurting organizations right now. So I think that's where I see sort of the motivation to try and collect more of this data, with the understanding that there will always be data points we're missing, with the understanding that this landscape will change and we'll need to sort of keep thinking this through as things evolve, but knowing that there are some questions that we should be able to answer here that we can't is very disheartening. I would say there are a lot of things that we have seen really fall apart in the cybersecurity policy space when it comes to measurement. Right, so there was a big anti-bot initiative several years back out of the Federal Communications Commission, where we were going to try to get the internet service providers to work on combating some of the bots on their networks. And basically, when it came time to actually assess whether that had had any impact, to try and collect some data and see, has the bot situation gotten better, that kind of fell apart. I think the same is arguably true of the CDOG and the insurance partnerships with the government, that when it came to the actual information collection and sharing stage, things really dissolved. And again, not to say that's the only reason, just that this is really hard to do, to get data out of companies. And I'm somebody who does it for research. I go to universities, I go to companies, I ask them to share their security incident data with me. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but it's always really labor intensive. There is sort of no easy way to do it. There's certainly no easy way to do it across multiple organizations to get a fuller picture of what's going on. And I think that there's been a lot of sense that we should sort of start voluntary or start small, see how, whether this can evolve organically, whether there could be some coalitions that come out of industry or are industry led. And I, if you can't tell from listening to me talk, have soured a little bit on that, because certainly in all the time I've been in this space, we really haven't seen anything. Bobby mentioned I've spent a lot of time working on insurance and cyber insurance for the past couple of years, right? That's another area where I feel when I got into that space a few years ago, there was this sort of, the insurers are going to collect all of this great data on their claims and what countermeasures they had in place, and then they're going to be able to give these really effective empirical analyses of what works for cybersecurity and what doesn't. And we really haven't seen any of that out of the insurers. And there are a whole bunch of reasons for that, right? Some of it is their data doesn't seem to show very clear correlations sometimes. Some of it, I was on another panel, and I think Nick was also on, and an insurance representative said, oh, the lawyers of our policyholders won't let them share any information about the incidents with us, right? So there are a lot of barriers to this. I would not undersell either sort of how important this problem is for being able to answer really fundamental questions, or how hard this is and how much there's a need for sort of serious government intervention, because the lesser steps, the sort of maybe companies are going to come together, maybe insurance brokers are going to come together and start publishing and sharing some of this. Really, I have seen no signs of that beyond things like the Verizon data breach investigations report. And that's a very small slice of this world that covers really only the things that data breach notification laws cover. So we haven't made a lot of progress. There are some really important questions to be answered. We know our intuition is not always good. The example I always give here is the change your password every 90 days advice, which has been sort of shown to not be helpful, to actually be counterproductive for security in a lot of cases, but we still have companies that adhere to it because it's so entrenched. There's such a sense that's a best practice. And I think it's long past time for us to try and make some progress towards combating some of our biases and intuition in this space.
Excellent. Thank you, Josephine. And I think, you hit the nail on the head. There are so many potential use cases here. I think one of the challenges actually is going to be, we have a sense of what we want at a 30,000 foot level from a bureau like this, but then sort of scoping down and making sure that we have the capacity to answer some of the most pressing questions is going to be one of the early challenges, I think, for a bureau like this. Moving on, last but not least, or possibly least, as I said in the intro, to Trey, use of metrics outside of government. Josephine touched on it a little bit. Bobby touched on it a little bit. But we have, for the most part, kind of talked about, okay, what are some uses that we could foresee within government? But talk a little bit about the potential for something like this to aid research, to aid private sector, whether it's on the supplier side, whether it's on the purchaser side, investor side. What are some potential uses that you can see outside of government for something like this?
Thanks for that, Rob. And it's been a good discussion so far. I enjoy being able to clean up on what is effectively the all-star lineup of wonkery on this topic. And so I will try to endeavor to say very little and get to questions and discussions here quickly. And really just try to make 3 points concisely. One is, for anybody who's debating going to get a PhD, witness the power of pissed off grad students that cannot find data. Because this is where this is coming from. I vividly recall a conversation doing my own one of these with Henry Farrell in 2009 saying, we're trying to tie cyber sort of diffuse things to something concrete, like how much does the government spend on cyber? I'm like, oh, that's got to be somewhere. I can go find that. This is 2009. This is in 16 different places. It's not anywhere and anybody agrees on. You get 30 different estimates. It makes answering, I think, to the points all that have been made, makes answering good questions about this space incredibly challenging. And it provokes very unhelpful debate. The notion of science as accreting knowledge, as stacking insight on top of each other, comes to be really powerful when we kind of understand what a stack is, how things are going to fit together, the nature of gravity. We don't have that in some cases right now. It's not to say it's a wild, wild west, but there's a lot of disagreement going on. So I would just say that the research component to this is potentially the most powerful, the most pure, and I think potentially the most persistent driver of the BCS and of the concepts behind it. The BCS opening up and providing access. You think about the National Archives as a good example. It's a repository, but it's also a community hub. For researchers working on those documents, on those topics and in those fields, it's a tremendous venue to try to convene, to build not only awareness, but also insight into those resources across generations of researchers. And I think the BCS can play a similarly valuable role. Second thing I'll say is this, and this is where I disagree with the esteemed group, so please feel free to throw fluid at me. I would argue the most significant value of the BCS here is not in understanding data around engagements, but it's in judging the health of this system. One of the significant limitations that we have, and I doubt everybody actually disagrees on this, but I'm going to come out and say it. One of the challenges that we have is when we think about cybersecurity metrics, in many cases, it's shaped by what we know, which is breach or not, compromise or not, failure or not, vulnerability or not. It's in this sort of binary engagement-driven thinking. And there is good work that gets done on system design and system security, but when we try to aggregate that out to the ecosystem of these technologies and people, and Chris talked about this in his opening remarks when he talks about resilience, this is a system made up in no small part by people, by process, and by technology. And it's the interconnection, the interleaving of those, the health of that system as a whole that is of most significant consequence and thus of most significant interest to us as policymakers in thinking about this problem. And so I would submit to you that as we think about the Bureau of Cyber Statistics, it's that thinking about health over just efficacy, taking and understanding the strength of existing lines of causality, lines of influence, understanding where there are missing points of influence, missing connectivity in the system, are significant interest to this group. This hasn't been a wild, wild west for a long time. We have rules about everything. We have rules about how big the packets are, where they can move, who they can talk to, how they're formatted. I mean, these are laid down in terra firma. But the way we think about the health of these interactions starts to get fuzzy the more we aggregate up. We can tell you where packets flow, but there's variable rules about how they get filtered. There's a lot of community decision-making about who's going to be seen to be a positive player in the space and who's negative. As you go up even farther, we're talking about cyber insurance and risk. The judgments that we use to determine risk vary even between the companies that are selling these products in ways that have material distinction. There is a good example of this, the war exclusion clause that's been written about by a number of folks that's come into great attention here in the last year and a half because of its impact on the cyber insurance market. How companies exclude claims that are associated with an act of war, the act of a state. These are being rebuilt. They're being reimagined in part because of the events of the last several years. There's two major firms that are working on differing definitions of this most critical, what are we not going to cover type of question. So I would submit that as we talk about the BCS, that the kind of data that we're interested in, I think, are in many cases most significant where they describe the function, the health, the utility of the system as a whole, and not necessarily just the efficacy of certain controls, the efficacy of certain mitigations. Third, and I'll just say this, and I think Rob asked me to talk about this, so I want to hit this nail on the head. there's a lot of motivated friends for the BCS. And I think in many ways, its significance, especially in its infancy, the first decade or so, is emphatically not as judge, as assessor, as arbiter, as answer of, or judge of any of these sorts of components. It's as provider of metrics and of data. And one of the things I think has been really positive you've seen about the conversation around the BCS is the inclusion of all these other kinds of intermediaries and third parties. We talk about the notion of risk. The insurance industry has been discussed, so I'm not going to get into that, but lots of other entities in this ecosystem care a great deal about risk. We think about within the supply chain, all of those different counterparty relationships between vendors, between integrators, and the eventual actual seller of a product. They are making significant determinations based on their perceived risk of doing business with these other entities. Much of that is financial, some of it is reputational, some of it is rooted in cybersecurity concerns. And so as we look at the role the BCS can play, there is a significant value in being a non-biased, non-judgmental arbiter of nothing, supplier of data, convener of discussion, source of not truth, but of information on which truth can be established or argued and debated in perpetuity. That, in my mind, is a significant point, I think, of aspiration, because when we think about the BCS, and as you've heard from the discussion today, it can do a lot of things. It's going to be asked to solve, or at least try to contribute to a lot of problems. Keeping that vision small, trying to keep it principled, and honing that sort of value up front will have a lot of long-term value for this endeavor as we go. I'll just close in saying this. I think one of the challenges that jumps out to me as we talk about the notion of collecting data in this way, trying to make it available to investors, to researchers, to consumers, is that the architecture on which that data is collected, is cleaned, is maintained, really has to be tolerant of knowing more than it displays. We can't assume that the privacy controls or the expectations of one source of data are going to carry with that data for all time, aren't going to vary by the context in which they're being used, how it's being aggregated, by the source, by the user that's actually obtaining that data, especially for government-sourced information. And so understanding the BCS, I think in line, as Bobby has said, as a statistics agency, one that's able to make complex decisions about its charges, about this data, and not simply a blank slate, a large Excel spreadsheet that has a .gov at the end of it, I think is really important. Empowering it to make those kinds of apolitical decisions, technical, architectural, data engineering decisions is an important choice. The BCS does have some agency. It's not stripped. It's not simply caretakers. And I think that's an important part of this. But anyway, I've talked on too long. Let's get to questions. I think this is a great topic.
So thanks for that, Trey. And there's a lot of threads to pull on. I think there's a lot to unpack there. I think I want to give Bobby, who messaged me in the chat, basically saying she wants to argue with Trey, the opportunity to chime in. And I know, Nick, you've got a couple thoughts, particularly I think around the question of this ecosystem measurement versus sort of control measurement and where that might fit in. So, Bobby, I'll kick it over to you for some reflections on what you've heard. If you want to go right at Trey, by all means, I think he'd welcome it.
So first off, happy to be considered amongst the group of pissed off grad students who can't seem to get data in order to do the right thing here, because it is really important. Really important for us to be able to characterize the world around us, because unless we can do that, I think as we see today, it's really difficult to come to any kind of meaningful decision-making activity, whether you be in government or in industry or other pieces. And so the first thing is I'm going to agree with you in that I think that the vision for the BCS is much more profound in the future than it is even today. And so I agree with you there, absolutely. And I think it's pivotal in our framing of it that we call it the Bureau of Cyber Statistics and not the Bureau of Cybersecurity Statistics, because it's really about trust in the digital infrastructure and the digitization of all of the things that we're doing. And that's, I think, for me, one of the reasons I feel such a sense of urgency about getting something in place so that we can evolve going forward. And so I'll argue with you a little bit in that I think that the construct about cybersecurity is important, absolutely, but is really just the smallest of the the arguments that we need to think about, right? Our whole future is in this digitized space. And so if we don't really understand the risks we're assuming today, the risks we're going to be assuming tomorrow, the health and trust we're putting in it, and don't have an empirical foundation for some of the decisions we're making, I think we stand to lose an awful lot more than guessing whether or not we got the controls in the cybersecurity framework right or wrong.
Trey, if you wanted to, I want to give you a chance to rebut.
No, I wouldn't rebut. I would agree and extend. I mean, I think the notion of this is empowering more effective ways of judging, weighing, and trying to improve the trust that we have in the ICT ecosystem is fantastic. Security is a product of adversarial relationships and weaknesses, risks that we don't manage well. I think it is a long-term vision, but it's a good vision, and I completely agree with that.
And Nick, I saw you perk up in the midst of Trey's comments there as well, so I want to give you a chance to lay into them as need be.
Well, I mean, I think that a lot of what Trey, you said, resonates with me in different areas of risk that government is responsible to manage. So we have an entire, in the resiliency part of our report, right? I'm going to use the royal hour. It's really more Rob's report than my report, but in the Solarium report, in the resiliency section, we have an entire recommendation and something that is owed to Congress by the end of this year or early next year in terms of a continuity of the economy report. That is, you're like, well, why would that exist in a cyberspace Solarium Commission report? It's because cyber is really fundamental to a lot of the functions of the economy. It's going to become increasingly so, and our resilience is dependent upon it. And the health of the ecosystem writ large is an extremely important piece at a macro level, right, of that, where we're talking about the economy, like as big as you get. However, when I look at, what do we think about for BCS, certainly as a first pass, it's in our ecosystem thing. And you may say, well, there you go, Nick, you're making my point for you. But I don't think it's about the macro ecosystem first. I think it's about the fundamental questions that we can't answer of, am I doing this thing more securely or not? And it's about risk management on more of a micro level, where we are right now, if you're what people are practically doing, right? There's, what do I wish people were doing? I wish they were doing some sort of risk analysis and saying, I'm going to make this decision to protect my shareholders and customers as a power company, because I think this is about what the threat is, and this is what my vulnerability is, and this is the consequence of something happening. And so if I invest here to close that vulnerability, it actually makes sense. That's what I wish people were doing. What I think people are doing right now is they're calling up the guy down the street and saying, hey, what are you doing? And then they're looking at that and saying, okay, if they're doing it, that's good enough for me. And I think what BCS can do is leverage some actual empiricization into that consequence, that conversation, to provide some quantization of the risk that isn't based on, well, Gartner said, or, I was having a conversation at the bar with another CISO and he said, well, I think you're probably underestimating that risk. It's like, okay, better go fix that. And that, to me, is the first pass principle of what can BCS get you, as where does the mission start? And I agree that it will probably grow over time. And I think that there are other elements that can come in. And in terms of who's going to be prescriptive in terms of saying, well, you should do this or not, absolutely, I don't envision BCS doing that. But I do envision, if BCS has collected a bunch of data and they look at the data and say, well, these are what the data say, that's not a recommendation. I would not anticipate them making a recommendation. Whether there's some in-house ability to analyze the data and say, wow, look at that. Most of the people who are using, who aren't using two-factor for their Active Directory servers have problems. Like, oh, okay, interesting. That's, whether or not that becomes prescriptive is absolutely not in the purview of a BCS. But should that be something that you're looking at? Yes. And do I think a more holistic measure that might be helpful for a policymaker to say, well, what's overall, how's our cyber health doing? You know, like whether are these population level statistics? Is this a public health thing, or is this more about individual interventions? I am firmly in the camp of more about interventions right now, because to Dr. Wolf's point, you know, the fact that we can't answer some of those fundamental questions is trying to crowdsource our way out of the answer and say, well, you know, given enough time, we're probably going to figure it out, and we should really be concerned about public health while we don't know how to vaccinate, seems backwards from where I sit.
So what I'm hearing, at least from where I sit, is rather violent agreement, just a matter of sequencing from Bobby and Nick, at least. Though Trey, correct me if I'm wrong on that, and I want to give you a chance before we turn. We're going to turn to the audience here in a second, but before we do, Trey, take us home.
I would agree. The only thing I'd add is just this: the notion that judgment is something that BCS might eventually do, I think is an important conversation, but I don't want any of the discussion or the debate that we're having about that to cloud the fact that simply collecting data and simply defining metrics, and when I say simply, I'm really lying, because neither of those are simple activities, would be incredibly valuable. And so I think the judgment piece can almost stand on its own as a topic for debate later, because the act of collecting and defining metrics, that would be supremely valuable in almost every part of what we've talked about today, before any judgment is rendered, before anything is even done to that data. Just having CSVs in one place, for God's sakes, would be great. So
beautiful. Thank you, Trey. We have a ton of questions. We're probably not going to get to all of them, but we're going to turn to them now in the hope that we might get to half of them. 2/3 of them. I want to turn to Josephine for this first one. It's a good one from Dwight Weingarten. How is the current environment without centralized cyber statistics collection affecting the cyber insurance market? I think we talked, I think all four panelists talked about the potential role that cyber insurance can play in bettering cybersecurity and the potential role that better statistics can play there. Josephine, can you just tell us a little bit more about the status quo and what's sort of ailing the industry right now?
Sure. So I think it's led to a couple things. The first thing is that when you buy cyber insurance, your premiums are all about how big your company is and not at all about what your security controls are. And so that means that the pricing of these policies is really completely unrelated to anybody's security posture, because the insurers don't feel they know how to assess those security postures. And a big part of the reason they can't do that assessment is because they don't have access to good empirical data that tells them you should have all of your policyholders do X, Y, and Z. And their own efforts to collect that data internally, I would say, have mostly led to them feeling like the most important stuff you can do is hire a lawyer really quickly. And the other part of that we've seen is a lot of these partnerships between insurers and security companies of different varieties. So there's a whole little cottage industry now of cybersecurity firms that are spun up to cater specifically to insurers and say, we'll come in and we'll assess all of your customers for you and tell you whether you should give them a policy or do sort of persistent monitoring on their networks. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing to see sort of more of those partnerships between people on the technical side of cybersecurity and people on the insurance side. But what I would say is, even in the case of those partnerships, we don't see any impact on the pricing, right? So there was like a big announcement that Apple and Cisco were going to partner with insurers, Allianz, a while ago. And it was all about how the Apple hardware was so secure that it was going to be really useful. And the Cisco security software was going to be really impactful. It was really big names in the tech world, certainly. And still, when you ask the insurers, okay, so does that mean that the customers that use these tools and these partners are going to get some kind of discount on the premium? The answer is no. So I would say sort of where that leaves us is with a cyber insurance market that doesn't know what it should be requiring of policyholders and is therefore pricing pretty blind. And we see some of the effects of that in the past couple of years when the claims for ransomware incidents have been rising and insurers have been getting nervous about what they should be doing and therefore raising prices because they don't know how to help their customers tamp down that threat.
A potential very clear and very obvious benefit of something like the BCS is to begin to move in a direction where we're a little bit happier with the status quo there, I think. All right, going to move to another question here. This one's from Alan McQueen. I'm going to ask it a little bit differently than he's asked it. I want to hear from all four of you in either an acronym or a single word, and it can be either DHS, Commerce, or IDK. Where should this be? Bobby, starting with you.
IDK.
Nick?
Same.
Uh-oh. Josephine?
DHS.
Trey?
Commerce.
Interesting. Okay. So there you go. A lot of IDK, a little bit of DHS, a little bit of Commerce. Bobby, you were about to chime in. When you think about some pros and cons of each, can you run us through them?
Yeah, so I think the important thing for me is that it exists, right? And there are obviously advantages and disadvantages in each of the locations. Clearly, there's a focus on growing the concentration of cyber-related expertise in DHS, and DHS has the national risk mission at sort of the federal level, and so there is some logic to the application of it in that location. It does align with the greater resilience question, and I think that also is an important sort of an important role. I think for me, it has to sustain itself as a statistical agency. That's a really unique thing and doesn't exist in the current cyber and infrastructure security organizations at DHS. And so there is a useful alignment to that and the risk. I think Commerce is has a lot of positives to it as well, given that risk decisions are fundamentally economic decisions in some shaping. There's a real alignment in the commerce related activities there as well. And there are a number of statistical agencies at Commerce, and so they have a real understanding of what the unique nature of such a thing is and how for it to function. I do again want to make sure that as we conceptualize this, as it's conceptualized in the Solarium Commission report, it's about levels above the technology. And that I think is an important thing, no matter where it's placed, for it to be, to keep your eyes on.
Trey, why Commerce?
So I think Bobby makes a really good point in terms of Commerce's own institutional understanding of what a statistical agency is. And that's a really significant thing, given the political weight that this will have. And in terms of significance, not necessarily influence to start, but the impact of its choices, especially early on in its career, being able to defend it from missions outside the realm of what a statistical agency should nominally do and really scope in its effect. I think the other piece is that Commerce is, it's an economic hub, but at the moment it's also where we think of placing the kinds of non-security first questions around technology use and value transfer. One of the things that's really significant to me is when we're talking about, like, for example, the CFIUS process and the way that that's changed over the last couple of years, the commerce equity in the VET process, the same way, the commerce equity is really seen to be sort of on the side of technology innovation provision. Whether or not that's the right long-term construct is, I think, a question far beyond what we would want the BCS to be tied to. But that's a more significant tech first, community first, and potentially even trust first, as opposed to security and resilience and risk, which is I think the more likely and reasonable focus for DHS. The other flip side of this, though, I think too, is it's a bit of a 55-45 situation. The challenge is DHS taking this on has to go from being quarterback for .gov cybersecurity, resource for all of the potential sector risk management agencies and owner operators in cybersecurity, running national risk management processes and all of the various cybersecurity capacity building efforts that exist with that, and now also owning dispassionately data on all things with respect to cyber and technology ecosystem. And that is, in my mind, an unenviable task inside of what is already a very tricky to manage sort of basket of different functions and roles inside of one agency.
Okay, I can see that argument. Josephine, walk us through why DHS.
So I don't have super strong feelings about this, I should say at the outset, but now that Trey's made his case, I feel the need to really make a very passionate case on the other side. So I think what I would say is, first of all, if this goes to the Department of Commerce, it will never happen, or it will never happen in a real way, because there will be, you cannot tell it from this panel, but there will be so much opposition to every part of this idea coming from industry. And if this is in the hands of the Department of Government that I at least view as sort of being most aligned with those private sector interests, I just don't believe that there will ever be any mandatory reporting component, that anybody will ever have to tell the government anything they don't want to. And they won't want to tell the government anything, right? We know that. So I don't see the Department of Commerce as being in a powerful position to compel anything from the private sector. I don't know that the Department of Homeland Security is in a particularly powerful position either. I think Trey is right that they're balancing a lot of stuff at the moment, and this is not an easy thing to add to anybody's portfolio. But I also think if we're going to say they are in charge of civilian cybersecurity, that has to mean something. That has to mean that sort of they are the clearinghouse and they have the data and the capabilities to do something with that. And finally, I think that sort of the two departments, the mission that I want driving this, the mission that I want sort of guiding what data is collected and what we do with it is a security mission, not an economic growth mission. And so that would be my instinct.
I think there are strong arguments in both directions. I wonder what a capability like this would look like alongside, for example, the National Risk Management Center at DHS, right? But you could also say, well, this has a similar function in some ways. What does it look like there? Nick, I don't want to leave you out of this fun. I know you probably have some thoughts on the politics of this question. You don't need to sort of weigh in and say one or the other, but I'm curious if you can unpack some of the politics of this question.
I think the politics are pretty simple, which is it's a wonky topic. My boss is a cyber wonk and will go deeper on cybersecurity topics than most any other member of Congress you can find. And he loves the BCS, and even he will admit when he talks about it in public, which can be sometimes to our chagrin, that like, this is the kind of thing that people are, when they say, oh yeah, some wonk in DC came up with this, like you have found the exact poster child for wonkish DC proposal. And what that means from a political standpoint is it needs care and feeding from politicals who are going to understand the immense power that it has, even if it's not all that intuitive, and just trying to describe its function can put most people to sleep. And, you know, I don't blame most people. I try and explain it to my wife and it puts her to sleep. So I think that it's the kind of thing that really, from a political standpoint, you need champions in the administration. You need champions in political leadership who look at the problems that my boss looked at 8 years ago and say, or 7 years ago and say, yeah, why can't I answer this question? And he's a dog with a bone with it for the last 7 years. And it's part of the reason we're having these conversations. And I think you need to see that kind of political leadership from within a cabinet agency. Will take any cabinet agency really at the end of the day. From where I sit, is that's the most important thing, that it's not just going to be Congress shoving something on the administration, because while we can do that, that's what the Constitution says. In terms of the efficacy, it's probably not going to be there unless there's a strong and willing partner from the administration. If that partner is the Department of Commerce, great. And if they're the Department of Homeland Security, great. And if it's some third party to be determined that we haven't thought of, great. Let's just get it done.
That all makes sense to me, especially from where I sit and observing many of the things that you're talking about there, Nick. So we've got about 10 minutes left. We have 18 unanswered questions. I don't think we're going to get to them. So I'm going to try to hybridize a few of them, pose them to the panel, and basically use this as an opportunity for sort of last remarks as well. So we'll go through the panel in reverse order. We'll start with Trey, go to Josephine, go to Nick, and then go to Bobby. I'm going to toss a few out there for you all to sort of noodle on. Stephen Teal, with dozens of statistical agencies already in existence, why not advocate for a bigger vision, a national lab for statistical data that offers expertise in data science and cybersecurity? I've had friends ask me, why not just put this in, for example, the Census Bureau? So there's one. I think another interesting one comes from an anonymous attendee who points out that there's a lot of work that's going on with CVE through DHS CISA operated by MITRE. A bunch of vulnerabilities there. Is there some immediate relevance for the BCS from that? What other sort of areas in government right now are potentially immediately relevant? I think that's an interesting question to sort of dive into. Lance Hoffman asks whether we have learned any lessons from the various efforts that we've had. CDOG was mentioned, but Lance also mentions the National Data Bank, which was suggested by social scientists over 50 years ago. It never came to be. Are there lessons that we're learning? And then I think there is a very important question, and several have raised it, around privacy and data reporting and how a Bureau of Cyber Statistics might manage concerns there. I'm very much sort of again, hybridizing a series of questions, but I think that's a theme that we haven't touched on, and we certainly could. So Trey, over to you. Grab onto any of those that you want to, or just go in a completely different direction with your last couple of minutes of remarks.
No, it's good. I'll try to not to stir up a new fight here amongst the panelists. All right, of the four, why not a data science national lab? Love it, but not for this. Again, I think scope really important. This has some very clearly defined potential values and a lot of less sort of clearly defined potential work areas. Adding a national lab to that, adding the relationship that comes with setting up a national lab, not to mention the logistical complexity, I think is too much for this one thing. So good idea, but not necessarily right now. On the NVD, eventually. It's a very good question, but I say we start with new things and then absorb all things later. BCS getting tagged with the NVD would eat it at almost whatever size and level of complexity the internal capacity the organization had. Adding managing the NVD to that, I think, would overwhelm 80-90% of the scenarios of what the BCS looks like. So in time, yes, and that improving the quality, the capture, the speed, the utility of that data set over time will have a lot of instrumental value in the kind of work that BCS does in security. But I don't think it's necessarily the first place you start, even though it's a codified problem. Lance, to see Dr. Hoffman yet again. The National Data Bank, I think, is a great question, but from this standpoint, it's, again, thinking about that narrow focus. Social scientists would benefit from something like this too. And so what you could very quickly see is the BCS has to turn around and take its processes and turn them into templates and make those available to NSF and start taking the opportunity for example, House Science staffers to come back and say, if you're taking anything and putting it into NIST, if you are funding things through NSF, you have to adhere to and publish data and share it through these BCS templates because we've already created it. It's already useful to many of you. Take advantage of that in that way. On managing privacy, and I think this is a really significant question, this is potentially the most significant challenge that BCS faces to its long-term value. Because if it avoids data sets and avoids questions based on the concern that judging the privacy values of the source relative to the consumer are too complicated, then it's going to take itself out of a lot of really significant areas of inquiry and evidence. So what I would suggest is this. We've seen a trend in some cases and outside advocates looking to drive more robust data management, open data, and privacy practices, and even positions inside of federal agencies that deal with significant amounts of data. And I think the BCS can be a poster child for this. Staffing, not just a privacy office, but line privacy advocates and attorneys so that working level business units inside of BCS have access to these resources, to these judgments without necessarily having to imperil the entire chain of command in that decision. Allowing judgments about privacy to include not just the source, but also the potential user. Judging the need for aggregation of privacy controls and making sure, third, that there's a technical architecture that supports that. These are in some ways critical to the BCS's function. So great questions.
Yep, beautiful, Trey. Thank you for that. And those hypothetical House, science staffers that may or may not have asked questions during this panel, right? Josephine, anything that you want to pull on, any threads you want to pull on there?
Just going by what I remember from the questions you threw out, I think the broader vision for sort of a comprehensive statistics bureau is a nice long-term idea. I think this is already a very broad vision. And it's a vision that requires a lot of pretty specific domain expertise to decide what are the questions we're going to ask, who are we going to ask them of, sort of what is the exact way to scope and frame all of this reporting. So I would say, at least for the moment, it's hard for me to imagine walking into the Census Bureau and saying, while you're going around to every single person in the country, could you also ask them about cybersecurity? You can tell I know nothing about how the Census Bureau works. But I think that it might turn out to be a very, very different skill set and a very different model. So I'd be a little wary of sort of trying to roll everything together at once, especially as you're trying to get things off the ground. In terms of the relationship with the existing National Vulnerabilities Database, the CVE, I think there's a lot of potential here to use all of those things, right? When you're looking at what kind of data should be reported about an incident, I think one of the things we want to know is is this because of a vulnerability that we already knew about, that was already logged somewhere? And if so, which vulnerability? And I think there's opportunity to make use of all of that information while still doing something very substantively different and new and additive. Mm-hmm. And then finally on privacy, I think probably there's some piece of this that is really more about liability, because most of the information that I would anticipate being collected here is going to come from companies. It's not going to be, here's Rob's social security number in a report. It's going to be, here's an incident that I would really love people not to find out about and use against me or use to sue me. So I think that the privacy question is an important one, but I think it's mostly privacy of organizations, and therefore from their perspective going to be a lot about, could anything that gets reported be used against me in court? And I'm open to the idea that there should be some liability protection, especially in the early days of this, but I wouldn't confuse it with the question of sort of individual privacy too much.
An interesting and controversial final salvo from Josephine to drag liability in. Nick, briefly, if you can, any final reflections?
I think both Trey and Josephine did a great job in answering the questions, and I think that both of their answers in particular on the privacy part were terrific. So I will not add anything to those. Except to say, Trey, I think more people should look at exactly what you're talking about in terms of designing privacy offices going forward. And since this will be an organization that's tied to people's conceptions of privacy, it's a good idea to get it right on the ground floor. But I will also say that I agree with Josephine that in a lot of cases, the privacy we're talking about is, did company X, have the privacy is company X actually fill in the blank, not, is there personally identifiable information or trade secrets even likely to get wrapped up into this? I think that one of the themes in terms of, well, what about the other statistical agencies? Like, why can't we factor this into other statistical agency works, or why did we come to this in the first place? And of course, Bobby follows me, so she can correct me where I'm wrong. But at least I look at this and say, why is there a need for some sort of actual government aggregation? Like, where's the failure here? And I think a large part of it is because a lot of this stuff is silent, right? I mean, with fire data, right? Like, you have the fire department, you call the fire department. Even if you don't call the fire department, your neighbor calls the fire department because your house is on fire and, your neighbor doesn't want his or her house to burn down. So there's a very public record. It is immediately evident that there has been a fire. So a lot of the barriers to collecting data about, well, what was the environment like before the fire? I mean, the initial hurdle, that activation energy to say, hey, something happened, so maybe there's going to be some collection around it, is much different in this case than in a lot of other, for instance, like I'm thinking fire because that's the canonical insurance example, and like how you matured the fire insurance industry. But I also think, it does start to look like some of the kinds of interventions we've seen with statistical agencies where we say, hey, did you lay people off? And, that too is more public, albeit something that, companies maybe don't want to advertise as much and don't want to put it out there. But even then, one of those laid off the laid off workers know that they've been laid off. And there are interventions. I mean, we actually, for statistical purposes for unemployment, go to both companies and laborers to kind of make sure that there's not a mismatch. But that, at least to me, is when I look at how do you fit this into other statistical agencies, part of the problem is that it's very shrouded in secrecy right now in terms of when there are incidents, and there's not necessarily the initial call of, when you look at a colonial pipeline and you say, okay, well, surely the federal government came onto the networks, right? They made a visit, they inspected the crime scene as you would in the physical domain, right? If someone had broken in to colonial pipeline systems and started turning off the systems, the FBI would be there. They would be on the premises. They would kick the door open. I've gone on for 4 minutes, Rob. I'm sorry. But, this is not the case in the cyber domain. So I'll shut up. Thank you. And Bobby, I'm sorry.
Nick, thank you. Bobby, last word to you.
Okay, so thank you guys. Really appreciate the just this convening. The questions are phenomenal. My respective panel members, I've really enjoyed. I guess I have 2 closing comments, and that is we should always remember that what we're trying to do is something at scale with clarity and transparency, and that we need to recognize the fear and misunderstanding that exists in the world. And for the BCS to be successful, it has to think through all 3 of those. So Trey nailed it in terms of thinking about and acknowledging the concerns of privacy at the beginning, making that an important, transparent comment. But I think the 2 things that we need to focus on to keep us from stopping and help us move forward is that a little bit of data goes a long way. If it's collected correctly, if it's aligned to answering the right question, it can drive change. And we have examples of this. And so picking the right question, the right set of questions for step 1, I think becomes really important in terms of how to bound and move forward. The second one is the nature of asking the question, even if it's a statistical agency, draws attention to the actions that need to happen next. And so the fact that you're asked this question, that a statistical agency like this or another policymaker or even an industry partner would ask the question helps us gain the commitment to moving forward. And I think both of those to me speak really volumes to our potential future success, regardless of placement in the federal government.
Brilliant. Thank you, Bobby. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Josephine. And thank you, Trey, for what has, I think, been the most informative and thoughtful conversation I've had on BCS. And I thank everyone who chimed in from the audience and who listened. And a big thanks to Atlantic Council for hosting this. And this is, the conversation. It's not the beginning of the conversation, but it's certainly not the end of the conversation either. So look forward to continuing engaging with all of you and the rest of you out there. Thanks for joining.